the truth is that the real story in this region is Iran, Iran's desire for nuclear capability, the oppression of the people of Iran, and Iran's desire to be, if you like, the top dog in the region.
And in Parliament, as well as Rishi Sunak's statement on the attacks against the Houthi rebels, there's debate on the Animal Welfare Bill. And in the Lords, there's questions on international aid and news and current affairs programmes. Well, like I said, Rishi Sunak addressing MPs later on the UK joining US airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. He's so far had the support of the Labour Party, despite Keir Starmer's previous insistence that Parliament should be given a vote before British military action. I've been speaking to Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. He's just returned from his fourth visit to the Middle East in the past 6 weeks. He's been in Lebanon, where there are growing tensions between the militant group Hezbollah and Israel.
Lebanon remains a big point of escalation between Hezbollah and Israel, and I was there to understand the ability of Hezbollah and the Lebanese to comply with that resolution. Nobody wants to see war between Hezbollah and Israel, but I think they recognize that the Israelis are deadly serious about that threat that remains. And then, of course, whilst I was there, we had the action following the Houthis firing at commercial vessels in the Red Sea, the action by the United States and by the UK. I wasn't able to get to the briefing that the government had with Keir Starmer and John Healey because I was in Lebanon. But I think it is really important that the House of Commons has an opportunity to question the Prime Minister about that action. But it is an action that I support because the truth is the Houthis are not a group of people sponsored by Iran that any of us should want to line up with. Firing at civilian and at military personnel in the Red Sea, hugely problematic, hugely escalatory, and very damaging to cost of living, not just in our own country, but for poor people, particularly all over the world.
I'll come to that in a moment and what might happen in the Commons next week. I just want to, on the Middle East, which is clearly a tinderbox at the moment, and lots of our listeners, going about their daily lives, trying to follow everything that's going on, the countries involved, the groups involved. Some will wonder, with everything else that's going on at home, why does Britain risk getting involved? Our history in this part of the world isn't great. And is there a risk that Britain, alongside America, ends up making the situation worse?
Look, I recognise that concern because many of your listeners will be reflecting on the Iraq war, will be reflecting on the situation in Syria, will be reflecting on the situation in Libya. But I remember when I came into this role over 2 years ago, being told very firmly that if the international community take their eyes off the Middle East, and the danger was that because of all that was happening in Europe and Ukraine, that we did that, we would be doing that at our peril. And one of the first things I did was that I went to the West Bank and I went to Israel. And I'm afraid I was very alarmed by what I saw on the West Bank, which has got considerably worse since the last time that I was there. The truth is that the real story in this region is Iran, Iran's desire for nuclear capability, the oppression of the people of Iran, and Iran's desire to be, if you like, the top dog in the region. It is Iran that sits behind the Houthis. It's Iran that sits behind Hezbollah. And that is why this is an issue that we simply cannot ignore. And so I do think it was right that there was targeted action, and I stress targeted, aimed at degrading the ability of the Houthis to fire into the Red Sea. It's important that we ask the Prime Minister hard questions about that not being open-ended, about those objectives not sort of widening into something else. The truth is Saudi Arabia have been attempting to deal with the Houthis over many, many years. And we've questioned sometimes the tactics, and certainly my party's questioned the tactics of Saudi Arabia in the past in relation to that. So this is complicated. No one says it's easy, but it's absolutely right that the UK, as a member of the Security Council, of the sixth richest economy in the world, and as a major global democracy alongside the United States, does not just sit back and do nothing.
You talk about the central role of Iran in all this. It's almost exactly 4 years to the day that Keir Starmer was pushing the idea of a piece of legislation, a Prevention of Military Intervention Act. He was talking about it actually in the wake of a US airstrike killing Iran's most powerful military commander, General Soleimani. And he said, Keir Starmer said at that point, Britain shouldn't be blindly following the Americans into what could turn out to be a war in the Middle East. He said there should be legislation that said military action could only be taken if, first, the lawful case for it was made, secondly, there was a viable objective, and thirdly, you got the consent of the Commons. Now, he's shifted his position on that, hasn't he? That you're now not, as Shadow Foreign Secretary, working on a piece of legislation called the Prevention of Military Intervention Act.
No, the truth is, in fact, that we will look at this issue if we have the privilege of serving. Whether it requires legislation, I think we've got to remain open-minded about, but it is an important issue. In this case, it is important to say two things. One, we aren't talking about boots on the ground. We're talking about very targeted action here on military sites. And the action was led by the United States. It happened effectively into Thursday night, and then Parliament wasn't sitting on Friday. Quite properly, the opposition and the Speaker were sufficiently briefed, and the House of Commons, I suspect, tomorrow will spend a good 2.5, 3 hours on this subject, and then may well return to the subject with a debate on Tuesday or on Wednesday. So I said in the House of Commons on Monday that there has to be full parliamentary scrutiny and consensus. I meant that. The Labour Party is serious about that. And that process will begin as soon as Parliament returns tomorrow afternoon.
But that isn't what Keir Starmer was talking about. And people will look at this, and this is where he is accused of flip-flopping, of saying one thing to get elected as Labour leader and then saying something different once he'd got the job. When he was running for the Labour leadership, he promised a Prevention of Military Intervention Act, that military action would not be possible without the consent of the Commons. Now, you said you're now being open-minded about it. Was he just being cynical, or has he moved away from having that Corbynista position?
No. Well, there's a couple of things. One thing is that during this period also, David Cameron put a vote to Parliament on action in Syria, was hugely embarrassed when Parliament rejected action in Syria, and some might say the consequences of Assad remaining in Syria and some of the huge problems we've seen in Syria are as a result of that vote. But the facts are...
But you voted against that.
No, Matt, it's important to say that vote... Yes, but what I suppose I'm saying is circumstances change. Now,
are you saying that you shouldn't have had... Are you saying that you shouldn't have voted against it? You shouldn't have been allowed to vote against it?
I think it was absolutely right that David Cameron had that innovation and Parliament had its say. Okay. But I'm also saying that it is appropriate in our system that wherever armed forces are committed, that Parliament has its say. But I think we should also understand that there will sometimes be circumstances where that say does not happen axiomatically, and that's in part because Parliament's not sitting, as we saw on this targeted action that we had last night. But there will be a very healthy discussion in Parliament tomorrow afternoon. I think there'll be a further debate in the days ahead, and it's right that these things should not be done without parliamentary consensus. And the way our system works also is that I think Rishi Sunak understood that it was likely that he would get Labour's support. He had Labour's support for that action. So the truth is there is a parliamentary majority for this targeted action, but we do need to ask the hard questions about purpose, about mission creep, about it being properly targeted, and about whether further action will be taken in the coming days and weeks.
So we've talked about the fact that the world is becoming a more dangerous place all the time. How much more dangerous will it be if Donald Trump returns to the White House?
Well, look, I mean, Lots of people have had things to say about Donald Trump, including the current foreign secretary, who I think described him as a misogynist in the past. But look, I think that here in Europe, the biggest concerns are about Ukraine. They're about the war in Ukraine and the support that we believe that the Ukrainians need and that the Prime Minister has found to continue standing up to Putin. They're also about NATO, and Donald Trump has raised some real issues about NATO and his belief in NATO in the past. And I hope that we could persuade him against those views if he still holds them. But what I would say is that the partnership between the United Kingdom and the US well goes beyond whoever is currently in the White House or currently in number 10. It doesn't matter whether it's Nixon, Kennedy, Wilson, or Heath. We have the biggest intelligence capability in the world. We both have a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. We both see the rules-based order and the free world as hugely important to uphold. And that's why we share common interests. And that will continue to be the case, whoever is the incumbent of number 10 or the White House.
Just finding back closer to home, I imagine you've seen some of the footage of the protests that we saw in London on the weekend, including some people shouting jihad, others talking about Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around. I just wonder how that makes you feel as a British citizen as much as a politician, I suppose. And do you agree with your former colleague on the bench, John Woodcock, who said that it should be an arrestable offence for talking about jihad on the streets of Britain?
Look, let me be clear. Of course, I support the right of people to protest, and particularly where they're raising their voices about children and women who are losing their lives in Gaza. But let us be absolutely clear. We cannot support people calling for jihad on the streets of this country, and the police should look closely at that. And people really do have to think carefully about lining up alongside the Houthis, lining up alongside an oppressive regime militia that persecutes women, persecutes children, persecutes LGBTQ minorities. I mean, really? Is that and is a proxy for Iran? I think there's too much simplicity here. We do have to be on the side of freedom and openness and recognise that there is much that we cherish in our own country, and that includes the right to protest.
David Lammy, there, the shadow foreign secretary, speaking about the situation in the Middle East. Well,